Was England truly united under John, or was it a kingdom perpetually teetering on the brink of chaos, a simmering pot of resentment just waiting to boil over? Did a king's divine right truly justify a reign of arbitrary cruelty and financial ruin? And what if I told you the story of England in 1215 wasn't about a king's glory but a desperate scramble for survival, a single, pivotal summer that reshaped the nation's destiny forever? Let's rewind. 1204. John, the younger son, had snatched the throne from his brother Henry. A messy affair fueled by whispers of betrayal and a suspiciously convenient death. He'd inherited a kingdom fractured by civil war, a land still reeling from the legacy of his formidable father. But John wasn't interested in rebuilding. He was obsessed with reclaiming Normandy, the ancestral lands lost to the French. And he was willing to do anything to get them back. The first few years were a masterclass in calculated brutality. John didn't just rule, he punished. He squeezed the barons dry, demanding exorbitant taxes, scutage, feudal incidents, inheritance fees, until their coffers were empty and their patience shattered. He used his royal courts not as a means of justice, but as a weapon to crush dissent, handing down sentences with capricious cruelty. A nobleman caught in a minor dispute could find himself stripped of his lands, his family imprisoned, his life forfeit, all at the whim of a king who enjoyed wielding absolute power. The barons, a collection of powerful, landed families, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They'd once held sway over their own territories, enjoying a degree of autonomy that was rapidly eroding. John's legalistic approach, his insistence on a standardized system of law, was a double-edged sword. It offered a veneer of order, a promise of protection, but it also meant that their traditional rights were being systematically dismantled. They could challenge their superiors in court, yes, but the royal courts were rigged in John's favor, a tool for extracting wealth and asserting dominance. Then there was the image John carefully cultivated, a king blessed by God, a descendant of Matilda, the last crowned empress of England. In 1207, he staged a lavish Christmas pageant, donning Matilda's imperial crown, brandishing scepters and a golden rod, draped in purple silk embroidered with gold. It was a deliberate performance, a calculated effort to project an aura of divine authority, to convince his subjects that his rule was ordained by God himself. It was a powerful message, especially when compared to the chaos of the previous years. England under John looked united, felt secure, but beneath the surface, the resentment festered. The barons, accustomed to a system of feudal privileges and personal relationships with their king, found themselves facing a fundamentally different reality. Kingship for them wasn't a matter of goodwill, it was a transaction, a precarious balance of power dependent on a single man's temperament. Richard Fitz-Nigel, John's justiciar, perfectly captured this dilemma. To some, the king does full justice for nothing in consideration of their past services or out of mere goodness of heart, but to others, he will not give way either for love or money. John's nature, as Nigel shrewdly observed, magnified the inherent contradiction of kingship, turning it into a weapon against his own subjects. The barons weren't just victims of John's greed, they were trapped in a cycle of dependency. They needed the king's protection, his legal authority, but he used that authority to undermine their power, to strip them of their wealth and prestige. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, a gradual chipping away at their autonomy. Then came the whispers. In 1212, Pope Innocent III, already infuriated by John's defiance of papal authority and his refusal to participate in the Second Crusade, declared him deposed. Philip II of France, sensing an opportunity, began to prepare an invasion force, amassing a fleet of over 1,700 ships in the port of Damme. The threat wasn't just military, it was religious. The Pope's intervention threatened to sever England's ties with Christendom, branding John as a heretic and plunging the kingdom into a devastating schism. The naval battle at Damme on May 30, 1213, was a stunning victory for Salisbury, John's half-brother, and the English fleet. They descended upon the French harbor, unleashing a torrent of destruction, setting ships ablaze and looting warehouses filled with provisions. The scene was apocalyptic, a sea of flames, the acrid smell of burning timber, the cries of the wounded and dying. Philip, witnessing the carnage from a distance, was reportedly out of his mind with rage, ordering the remaining ships to be burned to cinders. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a symbolic one, a crushing blow to Philip's ambitions and a reaffirmation of John's position. But John wasn't celebrating. He was desperately seeking a way out of his predicament, a means of restoring his standing with Rome. And he found it in a surprising act of submission. In July 1213, he sealed a charter, effectively handing over his kingdoms of England and Ireland to the Pope as papal fiefs. It was a humiliating concession, a recognition of his weakness and a desperate attempt to appease the Church. Marshall, once again a trusted advisor, urged caution, but John, blinded by his ambition, pressed ahead. This act of submission, however, didn't magically erase the underlying tensions. The barons, already simmering with resentment, saw it as a betrayal, a sign that John was willing to sacrifice his kingdom to the whims of a foreign power. The summer of 1214 was a whirlwind of frantic activity. John, fueled by a desperate desire to reclaim his continental possessions and driven by a stubborn belief in his own destiny, began planning a massive invasion of France. He assembled a formidable army, levied unprecedented taxes, scutage at a staggering 3 marks per knight's fee, and sought alliances with powerful figures like the Emperor Otto IV. But his efforts were met with resistance. The northern barons, weary of John's tyranny and unwilling to risk their lands and fortunes, refused to serve. Eustace de Vesci, a former rebel, had cautiously reconciled with John, but even he couldn't persuade his followers to join the doomed campaign. John, enraged by this second rejection, descended into a furious rage, abandoning any pretense of diplomacy and resorting to threats and intimidation. As John prepared for his invasion, the stakes were raised by the looming presence of Philip II. The French king, emboldened by his naval victory and the Pope's support, was determined to crush John's ambitions once and for all. The Battle of Bouvines, fought on July 27, 1214, was a disaster. John's carefully laid plans crumbled before the onslaught of Philip's forces. His Poitevin barons deserted him, leaving him to face the enemy alone. The English army, a patchwork of mercenaries and reluctant levies, was routed, its leaders captured or killed. John himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing back to La Rochelle in disgrace. The defeat at Bouvines wasn't just a military setback, it was a political catastrophe. It shattered John's image of invincibility, exposed his vulnerability, and left him utterly isolated. He was no longer the powerful, defiant king. He was a desperate, defeated man clinging to the remnants of his authority. Back in England, the barons seized their opportunity. They presented John with a list of demands, a charter of liberties designed to curb his power and restore the traditional rights of the nobility. It was a bold move, a declaration of defiance that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. John, unwilling to concede even a fraction of his authority, refused to negotiate. The following months were a period of intense conflict, a desperate struggle between king and barons. Both sides raised armies, fortified castles, and engaged in a series of skirmishes and raids. The country was plunged into a state of near civil war. Finally, in August 1215, the barons captured London, effectively bringing the king to heel. John, realizing that he had no choice but to negotiate, reluctantly agreed to meet with them at Runnymede. The result of that meeting was the Magna Carta, a document that would forever alter the course of English history. It wasn't a revolutionary manifesto, but a pragmatic compromise, a series of clauses designed to limit the king's power and protect the rights of the barons. It guaranteed due process of law, prohibited arbitrary imprisonment, and affirmed the traditional rights of the nobility. But the Magna Carta was more than just a feudal agreement. It contained principles that would eventually evolve into the foundations of English liberty. It established the rule of law, limited the power of the monarchy, and affirmed the rights of individuals against the arbitrary will of the state. John, however, never truly accepted the Magna Carta. He saw it as a temporary setback, a concession forced upon him by rebellious barons. He attempted to annul the charter, but his efforts were thwarted by the church. In the end, John died in 1216, a broken and defeated man. The Magna Carta, however, lived on, becoming a symbol of resistance to tyranny and a cornerstone of English liberty. So, was England truly united under John? Or was it a kingdom perpetually teetering on the brink of chaos? Did a king's divine right truly justify a reign of arbitrary cruelty and financial ruin? And what if I told you the story of England in 1215 wasn't about a king's glory, but a desperate scramble for survival, a single, pivotal summer that reshaped the nation's destiny forever? The answer, it seems, lies buried within the dust of Runnymede, in the echoes of a battlefield, and in the enduring legacy of a document that dared to challenge the very foundations of power.